She's useless, honestly, just someone who got comfortable spending what I built, Richard Carter said with a casual smile, lifting his glass as a few people around the table let out polite, uncertain laughs, the kind that linger just long enough to make the insult feel real, not quite a joke and not quite serious, but sharp enough to land exactly where it was meant to. And Evelyn Carter stood beside him in a navy evening dress, one hand resting lightly against the stem of her wine glass, her posture straight, her expression composed, as if the words had passed through the air without touching her at all. And for a moment, that was what unsettled the room the most, not what he said, but what she didn't do, because she didn't interrupt, didn't correct him, didn't even shift her weight. She simply watched him with the same quiet attention she might give to a stranger speaking too loudly in a place that required restraint, and the ballroom around them carried on in its low hum of conversation and clinking glasses, warm golden light reflecting off polished surfaces, a string quartet playing something soft and forgettable near the far wall. But the people closest to their table had begun to listen more carefully now, not openly, not in a way they would admit later, but enough that the next thing Richard said carried further than he probably intended. I mean, she used to help out years ago, small things, paperwork, scheduling, nothing major, but over time. He shrugged lightly, taking a sip. Well, you outgrow certain roles. And this time the laughter came quicker, a little more confident, as if permission had been granted, and across the table, a woman in a pale dress leaned closer, smiling in that practiced, agreeable way, while one of the older investors near the end of the table didn't smile at all, his gaze resting on Evelyn just a second longer than necessary before he looked down at his plate again. And still, Evelyn said nothing. She lifted her glass, took a small, measured sip, and set it back down with careful precision, her movements unhurried, controlled, as though the moment unfolding around her required observation, not reaction. And Richard, encouraged by the ease of it, the lack of resistance, leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm draped over it, relaxed, certain, continuing, as if he were telling a harmless story. At the end of the day, business is simple, he added. You need people who actually contribute. And there it was, clearer now, no longer softened by humor, and a quiet shift moved through the immediate circle of listeners, subtle but present, a tightening of attention, a hesitation in the rhythm of conversation, because even in rooms like this, where status often decided what could be said, there were still lines people recognized when they saw them crossed. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, composed, silent, her gaze steady, not on the people laughing, not on the woman across the table, but on Richard himself, as if she were noting something, confirming it, storing it away. And then, just as the conversation threatened to drift back into safer territory, her phone, resting against the table beside her glass, vibrated once, a quiet, deliberate interruption that almost no one noticed at first, except for her, and she glanced down, her expression unchanged, her fingers still, and for the briefest moment, the calm in her eyes sharpened, not with emotion but with recognition, as though something she had been expecting had arrived exactly on time. The phone vibrated again, a second pulse against the polished table, quiet but insistent, and Evelyn let her fingers rest beside it for a moment before she picked it up, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, as if she had already decided what this interruption meant long before it happened. And around her, the conversation stumbled, not fully stopping but losing its rhythm, because even those who had been laughing could feel that something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, and Richard noticed it too, his smile tightening slightly as he glanced at the phone in her hand, then back at her face, expecting perhaps an apology, an excuse, something small that would return control of the moment to him. But Evelyn did not offer any of that. She simply looked at the screen, her eyes scanning the name for less than a second, and then she answered, lifting the phone to her ear with the same calm precision she had shown all evening. Yes, she said, her voice low, even carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to her. And on the other end, the voice that responded was not casual, not uncertain, but structured, formal. The kind of tone that belonged in boardrooms and behind closed doors. Miss Carter, we are all here, the man said. The board is ready to proceed, but we cannot finalize anything without your authorization. And there was a pause, not from Evelyn, but from the room around her, because the words did not fit the image that had just been painted of her. And one of the executives sitting across the table leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening as if he had just heard something he was not supposed to hear, while Richard let out a small, dismissive breath, a soft scoff meant to reclaim the moment. Work call? He said lightly, glancing at the others as if to suggest that this was nothing. Just another interruption, something insignificant, but Evelyn did not look at him. She did not acknowledge the question at all. Her attention remained on the voice in her ear. "Give me 5 minutes," she said, calm, controlled, and then she ended the call, placing the phone back on the table. With the same care she had shown before, and for a second no one spoke, not because they were instructed not to, but because something in the room no longer felt simple, no longer felt predictable, and the older investor at the end of the table straightened slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, as if he were searching through memory, matching a face to a name he had not expected to encounter here, while the woman beside Richard shifted in her seat, her smile fading just enough to reveal uncertainty, and Richard, sensing the hesitation spreading around him, leaned forward again, his tone sharpening just a fraction. "Well, whatever that was," he said, forcing a small laugh. "I am sure it can wait. We were in the middle of something." And this time Evelyn turned her head just slightly, enough to meet his eyes, not challenging, not defensive, simply present, and in that brief look, there was no trace of embarrassment, no sign of someone who had just been diminished in front of a room full of people. There was only a quiet steadiness, as if she were allowing him to continue, allowing him the space to say more, to reveal more. And that was what made the next silence heavier than anything he had already said, because it was no longer empty, it was watching him back. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to crack, some sign that the balance he had built so carefully was still intact. But Evelyn did not look away, and that was the first mistake he made that night, because in rooms like this, control was rarely about volume, it was about who moved first, and she did not move at all, so he leaned back again, forcing ease into his posture, tapping the edge of his glass lightly with his finger. "Anyway," he said, his voice just a touch louder now, meant to pull the room back toward him. "As I was saying, growth requires focus, and sometimes that means leaving certain attachments behind." And the word hung there, deliberate, and a few people nodded automatically, more out of habit than agreement, but the energy had changed, the laughter did not return, it only hovered, uncertain, and across the table, the older investor finally set his fork down, the quiet clink against the plate sharper than it should have been, drawing a few eyes in his direction. He did not speak yet, but his attention had shifted completely now, no longer casual, no longer distant, and beside Richard, the woman in the pale dress adjusted her posture, her smile fading into something more measured, as if she were recalculating, while Evelyn reached for her glass again, not to drink this time, but to move it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small, precise adjustment that no one would have noticed earlier. But now in the stretched silence it felt intentional, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, even, carrying just enough to settle over the table without forcing its way in. "You are right," she said, and that alone was enough to shift several heads toward her, because agreement was not what anyone expected. "Growth does require focus," she continued, her tone unchanged, her eyes still on Richard. "And clarity," she added after a brief pause, and then she stopped, not finishing the thought, not explaining it, leaving it suspended just long enough to make people wonder what she meant, and Richard gave a short laugh, relieved perhaps to hear something that sounded like concession. "Exactly," he said quickly, leaning forward again. "That is all I have been trying to say." But the words came out slightly faster than before, less controlled, and that was when the man at the end of the table spoke, his voice calm but firm, cutting cleanly through the air without needing volume. "Clarity about what, exactly?" he asked, not looking at Richard but at Evelyn, and the question landed differently than the others had, not casual, not polite, but direct, and for the first time, the attention in the room shifted fully away from Richard, settling instead on her, and she met it without hesitation, without surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment as well. "About who is actually responsible for what?" she said simply, and there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just a statement, but it carried weight in a way that made several people straighten slightly in their chairs, because responsibility, in a room full of investors and executives, was not a casual topic, and the older man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself, while Richard exhaled through his nose a small, controlled sound that did not quite hide the irritation beneath it. "I think we all know the answer to that," he said, his tone tightening despite his effort to keep it light, but no one responded immediately this time. No one rushed to agree, and the silence that followed was not empty anymore. It was shifting, aligning, waiting, and Evelyn, still composed, still calm, let it settle for a second longer before she spoke again. "Do we she said, not as a challenge but as a quiet question. And that was the moment the room stopped pretending this was just dinner. No one answered her question, not immediately, and that hesitation stretched just long enough to expose something fragile beneath the surface of the room, because certainty, once interrupted, rarely returns the same way, and Richard felt it, even if he did not fully understand it yet, his fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass before he set it down a little harder than necessary, the soft clink sharper now. I think we are overcomplicating this, he said, forcing a measured tone, but there was a thin edge beneath it that had not been there before. This is a simple matter of contribution and leadership, and he gestured lightly around the table, as if the people seated there were proof enough of his point, but the gesture did not carry the same weight anymore, not after the call, not after the shift that had already begun, and across from him, the older investor leaned back in his chair, studying Evelyn with a quiet focus that no longer bothered to hide itself. Leadership, he repeated slowly, almost to himself, then looked directly at her. That is an interesting word, and a few others followed his gaze, not all at once, but enough that the center of the room tilted again away from Richard toward her, and she did not rush to fill the space, she let it exist, let the silence do its work, her hands resting calmly on the table, her posture unchanged, as if she had all the time in the world, and in that stillness, the faint sound of the string quartet returned, soft notes drifting through the background, the low murmur of other tables continuing just out of reach, but here at this table, everything had slowed, sharpened, focused, and then from 2 seats down, one of the senior partners, a man who had barely spoken all evening, cleared his throat quietly. Evelyn, he said, using her first name with a familiarity that had not been acknowledged before. That call, was that about the board meeting tonight? And the question landed with precision, not loud, not dramatic, but exact, and Richard turned his head slightly, his expression tightening as he looked from the man to Evelyn, as if trying to catch up to something he had missed. Something everyone else might already be starting to understand, and Evelyn nodded once, simple, direct. Yes, she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything she had said so far, because it confirmed what had only been implied, and a subtle shift moved through the table again, chairs adjusting, eyes narrowing, calculations beginning, and the woman beside Richard lowered her glass slowly, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, while Richard let out a short breath, almost a laugh but not quite. There is no board meeting tonight, he said, his tone firm now, corrective, as if he were restoring order. I would know. And for a moment that sounded convincing, familiar, the voice of someone used to being the final word, but the older investor did not look at him, he kept his eyes on Evelyn, waiting, and she did not contradict Richard immediately, she did not rush to correct him, she simply reached for her phone again, turned it slightly on the table so that the screen faced inward, not to show it but to align it, to acknowledge it, and then she spoke, her voice as calm as before. You would, she said, and there was a brief pause, just long enough to separate what came next. If it were your meeting, and the sentence settled over the table with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and this time, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was heavy, deliberate, and Richard did not smile, not anymore, because something in the room had moved past him, and he could feel it slipping, even if he could not yet see where it was going. Richard did not respond right away, and that was new because he was a man who filled space quickly, who corrected, redirected, reasserted. But now there was a fraction of a second where he simply sat there, his expression fixed, his eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether this was still part of the same conversation he thought he was controlling, or something else entirely, and across the table, the older investor leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer concealed. Not his meeting, he repeated quietly, almost testing the words, and Evelyn did not rush to explain, she let them settle, let the meaning expand on its own, her calm creating more tension than any raised voice could have, while the others at the table began to shift in their seats, subtle movements, a glass set down, a napkin adjusted, the small physical signs people give when their certainty begins to fracture, and the man who had asked about the board meeting spoke again, this time more carefully. Then whose meeting is it? He asked, and this time the question carried weight because it was no longer casual curiosity, it was alignment, it was recognition beginning to form, and Richard turned toward him quickly, seizing the opening. There is no meeting, he said, more firmly now, the edge no longer hidden, and even if there were, Evelyn would not be involved in anything at that level. And a few people glanced at him, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just observing, and that was enough to shift the balance again because he was no longer being followed automatically, he was being watched, and Evelyn turned her head slightly, not toward the man who had asked but toward Richard, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "You are right," she said, and for a brief moment relief flickered across his face, quick and almost invisible, but it was there, because agreement meant control, or at least it used to, and then she continued, "I am not involved in anything at your level." And the pause that followed was precise, measured, intentional. "My level is different," she finished, and this time no one laughed, no one moved to soften the statement, because the tone had shifted completely, and the older investor exhaled slowly, a quiet sound that carried more understanding than surprise, while the woman beside Richard lowered her gaze, her earlier confidence fully gone now, replaced by the careful stillness of someone who realizes they may have misread the entire situation. And Richard leaned forward again. But this time there was no ease in the movement, no casual control, only a tightening, a need to re-establish something that was already slipping. "Evelyn," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, "I think you are misunderstanding what is being discussed here." And for the first time there was something else beneath his words, not anger, not yet, but uncertainty. And Evelyn met his eyes without hesitation, without resistance, simply present. "No," she said quietly. "I understand it very clearly." And then she reached for her phone again, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and as she picked it up, the screen lit briefly, reflecting in the glass of the table. And though she did not turn it outward, though she did not show it, the movement alone drew attention because now everyone was watching, not waiting for her to speak, but waiting for what would happen next. And the room, once filled with easy conversation and polite laughter, had narrowed into something else entirely. Something sharper, something quieter. Something that no longer belonged to Richard at all. The room had shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with the kind of clarity that demanded attention. As Evelyn picked up her phone and held it in both hands for a brief moment, her thumb hovering over the screen, not pressing any buttons, not showing anyone what she was about to do, but the stillness of the gesture drew eyes, subtle but undeniable, and Richard, realizing that the energy had moved away from him entirely, leaned back, trying to appear casual. But the tightness in his jaw betrayed the unease he could not yet name, while the older investor at the end of the table tilted his head slightly, his expression sharpening, and for the first time, a quiet sense of anticipation entered the room. Not loud, not obvious, just the kind of tension that makes people pause mid-bite, mid-sentence and listen because something was about to happen, something important, and they did not know what it was. And Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm, precise, carrying over the table just enough to be heard without raising it. "I need the documents prepared for immediate review," she said, and the words were simple, unassuming, but the effect was immediate. The people around the table exchanged quick glances, subtle nods, silent acknowledgments that things were no longer as they had been moments before, and Richard's eyes widened fractionally, a small involuntary movement, almost imperceptible. But Evelyn noticed it, her gaze sweeping over him in a quiet, controlled assessment, and she let it linger, letting the realization settle in that the power balance had begun to shift, and in that pause, there was a sense that everyone present understood that she was no longer a passive participant. She was an actor shaping the room, and her actions, her calm, deliberate actions created a ripple through the group, a ripple that started in their expressions, the slight tightening of fingers around utensils, the adjusting of glasses, the repositioning of chairs, subtle movements that conveyed attention, awareness, and most importantly respect. And Richard tried again, his voice measured. "That is unnecessary, Evelyn, we are handling things here, you do not need to intervene." And the words, though confident, lacked the conviction of before because he felt deep down that she had already taken control, and Evelyn responded without raising her voice, without dramatics. "It is already underway," she said, letting the statement hang, allowing the silence to amplify its meaning, and for a moment, the soft string music in the corner seemed louder, the hum of other tables fading, the warm golden light falling on the polished surfaces highlighting the small, deliberate movements of her hands as she set the phone down, aligning it with the edge of the table, the gesture precise, methodical, and the subtle power in it undeniable. And the older investor nodded again, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and a few others shifted slightly, eyes drawn to Evelyn, to the way she carried herself, to the quiet authority in the calm of her stance, and Richard realized, finally, that the room had been recalibrated, that the narrative he had been telling had been interrupted, not by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet, controlled assertion of presence, and for the first time in the evening, he felt the gravity of the situation settling in. The room aligned with her, not him, and Evelyn, still composed, did not acknowledge his glance, did not need to. She simply allowed the quiet dominance of her decisions, her unspoken control, to permeate the space, and in that moment, the balance had tipped, subtle, measured, complete, and the room, once filled with polite chatter and casual assurance, held its breath. The subtle shift in the room had solidified, a quiet acknowledgement that things were no longer under Richard's control, and Evelyn remained seated with perfect posture, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, one finger tracing the rim of her glass almost imperceptibly, a deliberate rhythm that drew attention without sound, and as the string quartet played softly in the background, the golden light glinting off the polished silverware, several people leaned slightly forward, sensing the change, feeling the weight of her presence, and Richard, sensing the imbalance, straightened, cleared his throat, trying to reclaim authority. "Evelyn," he began carefully, his tone calculated. "This is not how things work here. You are not supposed to be involved at this level." But the words fell flat, their intended effect muted by the undeniable clarity in her expression, calm, focused, and unwavering, and a young executive seated across from her tilted his head, eyes wide, as he recognized the subtle command in her demeanor, the quiet assertion that even without raising her voice she had already taken control, and Evelyn's gaze met his briefly, a small nod, almost imperceptible, yet the acknowledgement carried weight, and the room began to adjust, people shifting minutely in their chairs, leaning slightly, exchanging silent looks that conveyed a new understanding, while Richard's smile faltered, the controlled composure he had relied upon cracking just enough to reveal his surprise, and the woman sitting beside him, once confident, now kept her hands folded in her lap, observing, recalculating, realizing that the game had changed without fanfare, without announcement, and Evelyn reached slowly for her phone again, lifting it with deliberate care, aligning it on the table so the screen faced inward, a gesture that was precise and measured, commanding attention through absence rather than action, and she spoke softly, just loud enough for those near to hear. "The documents must be ready within the hour, and all approvals must be confirmed." And the statement, simple and unadorned, landed heavily, setting the parameters, establishing the perimeter of authority, while Richard's hand tightened around the edge of his chair, his mind racing, trying to calculate the shift he could not yet see, and a senior partner sitting near the end of the table exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement that the situation had changed, that leadership, clarity, and control were no longer defined by volume or presence alone, and as Evelyn set the phone down, the soft click echoed in the quieted room, the sound amplified by attention, as if the table itself acknowledged the transition, and she allowed the silence to stretch, to settle, to create a space in which every eye and every thought was aligned with her, not him, and Richard realized that the narrative he had constructed for the evening, the one that had seemed so firmly in his hands, was slipping away, replaced by a new understanding that unfolded without spectacle, without argument, simply through the measured, deliberate assertion of presence and authority, and the golden light continued to fall across the table, the soft notes of the string quartet threading through the pause, highlighting the subtle movements, the careful placement of hands, the poised gestures that conveyed control, and in that moment, the balance of the room had shifted entirely, quiet, precise, complete, leaving Richard to feel the gravity of the change even before he fully understood it, and Evelyn, composed, unmoving, let the effect linger, allowing each person present to absorb it, and the quiet intensity held, filling the space, commanding attention without a single raised voice. The atmosphere around the table had become taut with quiet anticipation, every small movement magnified by the heightened attention, and Evelyn remained poised, her hands lightly resting on the polished surface, her fingers brushing against the edge of her glass with deliberate care, a slow, controlled rhythm that drew the eyes of those seated closest, while Richard shifted slightly in his seat, a subtle adjustment that spoke of unease despite his efforts to appear composed, and the senior partner leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze unwavering as he regarded her with new recognition, an acknowledgement that her presence, her calm authority, carried weight that had not been visible before, and the murmurs at neighboring tables had fallen away to background hums, almost insignificant, as if the entire room had tilted toward this quiet power, and Evelyn's gaze swept across the table, pausing just long enough on each person to let them feel the measured attention, the awareness that she had already noted their reactions, their subtle shifts, and she lifted her phone again, turning the screen just slightly, aligning it in a way that was precise and intentional, and when she spoke, her voice was low, even controlled, carrying across the table without raising a sound. Confirm that all team members have reviewed the latest projections and that any discrepancies are flagged immediately, she said, and the simplicity of the command belied the authority it projected, the quiet certainty that had already begun to redirect the room, and Richard opened his mouth to respond, to assert a correction, but the pause, the calm in her stance, the unwavering eye contact held him back for a moment longer than he expected, and he realized, perhaps for the first time that evening, that the control he thought was unassailable had shifted, invisible but undeniable, and across the table, a young associate tilted her head, eyes widening, recognizing the shift, the subtle but complete realignment of authority, while the woman sitting beside Richard, once confident, now kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, observing, reassessing, understanding that the balance had changed without spectacle or confrontation, and Evelyn allowed the silence to linger, to stretch, the absence of immediate reaction amplifying the impact, every small movement in the room magnified by attention, the polished silverware reflecting the soft golden light, the faint strains of the string quartet threading through the space, and she took a slow breath, not hurried, not visible in its effect, and then said quietly, "I will oversee the implementation personally," and the words, though calm, carried authority sufficient to silence doubt, to redirect focus, and the older investor exhaled softly, a small acknowledgement that the situation was now clearly defined, that leadership had been asserted, and a few other people shifted slightly, subtle gestures, acknowledging the quiet command, and Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the tightening unnoticed by most, but Evelyn noted it, a quiet recognition of the subtle surrender of dominance, and the room collectively absorbed the shift, the conversation reduced to careful attention, recalculation, observation. While Evelyn leaned back slightly, maintaining composure, allowing the effect to cement, every gesture, every pause meticulously measured, and Richard finally spoke, but the confidence in his voice had dulled, replaced by a cautious tone. "We will proceed as you direct," he said, and the words carried more concession than agreement, and Evelyn nodded once, slight, understated, yet complete, and with that single motion, the alignment of the table, the acknowledgement of her authority, and the recalibration of the room settled fully, quiet, deliberate, unspoken, a power established without spectacle, without confrontation, the kind of authority that was felt by all present, absolute in its subtlety, and the evening continued, but the energy had shifted permanently, each glance, each gesture, each small movement now measured against the calm, unwavering presence at the head of the table. The room held its breath, the subtle authority she had established now settling over every seat at the table, and Evelyn allowed a brief moment of silence, letting it stretch long enough for the presence of control to be felt without a single raised voice. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing faint, deliberate patterns on the polished wood, each movement precise, measured, conveying more than words could, and Richard shifted in his chair. The small creak of the leather, noticeable only because the rest of the room had grown still, attentive, recalibrated to her rhythm, while the senior partner leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed, his attention fixed on the calm, deliberate assertion she maintained, and the younger associates exchanged subtle glances, realizing that the quiet composure was more powerful than any raised tone, more commanding than any immediate reaction, and Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly, scanning the faces of those present, letting each person feel the precision of her observation, the awareness that nothing in the room escaped her notice, and then she reached for the folder at her side, opening it carefully, deliberately, the soft rustle of paper carrying more weight than any spoken command, and she laid it on the table, aligning it with exact precision, the edges perfectly straight, a subtle assertion of order and control, and she looked back at Richard, meeting his eyes with steady calm, not a challenge, not a threat, but an unmistakable signal that the balance had shifted completely, the authority now hers to command, and the soft hum of conversation elsewhere in the room seemed distant, insignificant compared to the weight of the quiet, deliberate tension here, and she spoke, her voice low, smooth, controlled, cutting through the quiet without raising in volume. "We will proceed according to the timeline outlined here, and all approvals will be confirmed by the hour," and the clarity of the statement left no room for debate, no ambiguity, just the unmistakable assertion of a decision already in motion, and Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a small adjustment unnoticed by most, but Evelyn noted it, the subtle shift, betraying his understanding that the balance had irrevocably changed, and the older investor nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, not of agreement but of recognition, that leadership had been asserted without spectacle, without confrontation, simply through measured presence, precision, and the careful timing of words and actions, and the woman beside Richard lowered her hands into her lap, folding them neatly, eyes wide with realization, adjusting her posture as the quiet authority radiated across the table, while Evelyn closed the folder with a soft, deliberate snap, setting it in front of her, and the sound carried across the room in its understated finality, signaling the completion of her assertion, and for a moment, the room existed in this suspended state, all attention focused, all calculations reconsidered, and Richard exhaled quietly through his nose, a controlled release, the realization of lost control settling in even before he could articulate it, and Evelyn leaned back slightly, maintaining posture and calm, letting the effect deepen, every person present absorbing the weight of measured power without a single dramatic gesture, and as the soft golden light reflected across the table, the glint of polished silverware emphasizing small, intentional movements, the finality of her command resonated, unspoken acknowledgement settling fully over the room, and in that moment, the atmosphere was complete, the control established, the room aligned with her decisions, and the subtle, quiet intensity held, absolute and unmistakable, leaving Richard and all others to adjust silently to the new order that had been asserted, deliberate, precise, and unyielding.